Kentucky's forests have never been quiet, but the night her mother died, the woods behind the old Harrow farmhouse fell into a silence so complete it smothered every lantern glow and swallowed every breath. The girl remembered the way the trees seemed to lean inward, as if listening to something they weren't meant to hear. She remembered the way her father stood beside the fresh grave, shoulders stiff, eyes empty, his hand gripping her arm as though she might drift away like mist if he loosened his hold. After the burial, people from town kept their distance. They sensed something unspoken lingering around the farmhouse, something colder than grief. Her father drew the curtains and locked the doors, insisting the world had no place for them now. He walked through the dusty hallways as if following someone only he could see, whispering to shadows, tracing patterns on the walls left by time or by something else. The girl tried not to notice the change, but the change noticed her. It happened on the 10th night, when the moon was thin and colorless. Her father shook her awake, his voice trembling with a devotion that didn't feel like love. He led her barefoot through the unlit forest, branches scratching her skin, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. She followed because she had always followed, and because fear had a way of stealing her voice before she ever understood what she needed to say. They reached a clearing she had never seen before, though it felt disturbingly familiar, as if carved from a memory she didn't want. A small wooden cabin stood there, a cabin she'd sworn had never existed. Her father took her hand, lifted it to his chest, and told her tonight would bind their blood forever, just as the ancestors intended. His smile was gentle, but something in his eyes was wrong in a way that made the coldness of the grave seem warm by comparison. She didn't understand his words then, not fully. But she understood the forest's silence. She understood the way the ground trembled under her feet. And as the wind swept through the trees like a whispered warning, she knew that whatever was beginning in that clearing had been waiting long before her mother died and would not end unless someone stopped it. The mother's mysterious death lingered over the Harrow household like a fog that refused to lift, settling into corners of memory and echoing through every whisper in town. In the days leading up to her passing, she had moved like someone carrying a secret too heavy to share, her eyes always avoiding the windows that faced the woods, her hands trembling whenever the wind pushed against the door. Neighbors recalled seeing her walk the forest path alone at dusk, pausing as if listening to something calling her from deeper within the trees. She had spoken less with each passing week, her once lively voice fading into a hush that made even her laughter sound like an echo of itself. When she fell ill, the doctor could find no cause, no fever, no infection, only a gradual weakening that seemed to drain her from the inside out, as though something unseen was taking pieces of her until she had nothing left to fight with. The night she died, the sky hung low and swollen with storm clouds that never broke. The girl remembered waking to the sound of her father shouting, though the words were muffled by walls and panic. By the time she reached the doorway, he was already kneeling beside the bed, clutching his wife's cold hand, his face twisted with something she couldn't understand. Not grief. Not shock. Something stranger, sharper, like the fear of being caught. He refused to let the doctor examine the body and insisted the burial take place immediately, as if delaying even a few hours might reveal something he didn't want anyone to see. Villagers who gathered for the hurried funeral noticed strange details, how quickly the coffin was sealed, how the father declined every offer of help, how the ground at the burial site seemed disturbed before the diggers even touched their shovels. Rumors spread quickly, growing roots in the fertile soil of isolation and unease. Some said the mother had been trying to escape the woods that night and never made it back. Others whispered that she had discovered something about her husband, something ancient and unsettling, tied to the family's history and the dense thicket behind their home. A few claimed she had confided in them that she felt watched inside her own house, that her husband had begun speaking of traditions she had never heard of, rituals meant to honor a bloodline she wanted no part of. Her death, to them, seemed less like a tragedy and more like a warning that came too late. The girl absorbed all these murmurs in silence, feeling them stitch themselves into her understanding of the world until every sound in the woods carried suspicion and every memory of her mother felt unfinished, like a story cut off before revealing its most important truth. After the mother's burial, the father changed in ways that were impossible to ignore, though he moved through the house with the same familiar footsteps and spoke with the same deep voice that once made the girl feel safe. It began subtly, as though grief had sharpened him rather than broken him. He watched her constantly, not with parental concern but with a silent intensity that made her feel like something fragile he feared might escape. He no longer allowed her to visit neighbors or walk into town alone, insisting that the world outside their door had turned unpredictable and cruel. When she protested, he would place a heavy hand on her shoulder, his grip firm enough to silence her but gentle enough to disguise the pressure as affection. She noticed how he locked the doors earlier each evening and how he paced the hallways long after midnight, murmuring words she couldn't hear, sometimes stopping abruptly as if listening for a response. His interactions with the townspeople grew strained, even hostile. Men who once shared coffee with him at the general store said he no longer met their eyes, and when they attempted to offer condolences, he brushed them off with a coldness that made them step back. Women who brought meals in the days after the funeral were turned away at the door without explanation. He seemed determined to sever every tie that connected the family to the community, drawing the girl into an isolation she had no power to resist. The house itself felt different under his new rules, as though he were rearranging not just furniture or routines but the very boundaries of her world. Inside his study, where she had never been allowed before, she began to hear the scratching of pen on paper late into the night. On one occasion, she glimpsed through the crack of the door a stack of old, leather-bound books spread across his desk, their pages filled with symbols she couldn't decipher. He slammed the door shut before she could see more, his face pale and tight as he warned her never to enter again. His temper, once rare and predictable, now flickered without warning, sparked by the smallest things: a misplaced dish, a forgotten chore, a question asked at the wrong moment. Yet every time his voice rose, he quickly followed it with an apology whispered too close to her ear, accompanied by a lingering touch that made her skin crawl with confusion. What unsettled her most was the way he spoke of her mother. Not with tears or reverence, but with a strange reverence mixed with resentment, as though her death had unlocked something he believed was promised to him. He began referring to their family as if it carried a destiny she couldn't see, a path only he understood. The girl sensed that grief was not what consumed him, it was something far older, rooted not in loss but in obsession, and she realized with growing dread that whatever had changed him did not begin with her mother's death, it only became visible because of it. The night her father took her into the woods felt unreal from the moment he woke her, his voice gentle but trembling with an excitement she had never heard from him before. The lantern he carried cast long, jagged shadows across the bedroom walls, and for a moment she wondered if he expected her to refuse, but he simply watched her dress with an expression that made refusal feel impossible. Outside, the air was damp and cold, the kind of cold that seeped through cloth and skin and into the bones. He guided her along the narrow path behind the house, a path she had been forbidden to walk alone since her mother's death, his fingers wrapped too tightly around her wrist. The forest swallowed the light as they moved deeper, branches closing in like ribs forming around a beating heart. The silence felt unnatural, as if every bird and creature had fled long before their arrival, leaving only the sound of their footsteps and the irregular rhythm of his breathing. He spoke softly as they walked, his words drifting between fragments of memories and strange declarations about their bloodline. She tried to understand, but everything he said felt coated in a language older than the English he used, as though he were repeating phrases he had memorized rather than fully grasped. He insisted that this night was important, that it marked the continuation of something sacred that her mother had failed to honor. Each time she asked what he meant, he simply squeezed her wrist harder and told her she would understand when they arrived. The lantern flame flickered as though trying to warn her, but she followed, half dazed by fear and confusion, unable to break free of the pull he exerted on her life. When they reached the clearing, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not physically but in the way the world feels moments before a storm breaks. In the center stood a crude arrangement of stones encircling a patch of earth worn bare, as though footsteps had danced across it for generations. Her father stepped into the circle and beckoned her to follow, his expression radiant with a devotion that frightened her more than any anger ever had. He produced a small object wrapped in cloth and held it as reverently as a priest might hold a sacred relic. He spoke of bonds stronger than marriage, of a union meant to bind their spirits and preserve the purity of their lineage, repeating the words as if reciting them from memory etched into his mind by ancestors she had never known existed. The girl felt her pulse quicken as he placed the cloth-wrapped object in her hands, the weight of it unfamiliar and ominous, the ritual beginning around her before she fully realized she had no understanding of what she was being led into. The cabin appeared so suddenly between the trees that the girl almost believed it had risen from the earth in response to her father's footsteps, summoned rather than discovered. She had walked these woods all her life and knew every bend, every cluster of ash and sycamore, every hollow where deer bedded down during winter storms. Yet she had never seen this structure before, its roof sagging under the weight of decades, its walls darkened with age and something that looked uncomfortably like scorch marks. The clearing around it felt unnaturally still, as though the forest held its breath whenever anyone approached. Her father stood before the door with a strange reverence, touching the frame lightly with the tips of his fingers, whispering a phrase she didn't recognize. It wasn't English, nor any language she had heard her mother speak, and it sent a cold shiver down her spine. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and ashes, as if a fire had burned there long ago and never fully died. The lantern light revealed cramped walls covered in carvings, spirals and symbols etched so deeply into the wood that splinters stuck out like thorns. Some symbols were familiar in shape but wrong in their arrangement, twisting into patterns that felt designed to make the eye linger too long. Others were completely foreign, resembling bones, roots, or skeletal hands reaching toward the ceiling. She ran her fingers lightly over one of the carvings and felt grooves worn smooth by many hands before hers. Her father watched her intently, his expression bright with anticipation, as though her recognition, real or imagined, validated something he had long awaited. The room held only a few pieces of furniture, all hand-carved and placed with deliberate precision. A narrow bed pushed against the far wall, its posts carved with the same symbols, sat beneath a window so small it barely allowed the moonlight to seep through. A wooden table near the center held a collection of objects wrapped in cloth, their shapes suggesting bowls, blades, or containers of some unknown purpose. Her father moved toward them with practiced ease, as though he had visited this place many times while she slept, though he insisted this was their first time going there together. He unwrapped one of the bundles and revealed a wooden figurine carved into the shape of a woman with a hollow chest, its eyes empty and its face expressionless. She felt a sharp twist of unease as he placed the figurine beside another carved figure, this one resembling a man whose arms extended outward, embracing nothing and everything at once. What unsettled her most was how familiar the cabin began to feel the longer she stood inside it. It reminded her of dreams she'd had as a child, dreams she had forgotten until the moment her foot crossed the threshold. It felt as though her mother had once stood where she stood, had once traced the same carvings with trembling fingers. Each breath inside the cabin tasted like memory, like secrets buried beneath generations of silence, and the girl realized with growing dread that this place was not new to her family but central to it, a hidden heart beating in the middle of the woods, waiting for her long before she ever knew it existed. The longer she stayed in the clearing, the more she became aware of how unnaturally quiet the forest had become, as though the woods themselves were holding back some terrible truth. The usual sounds, rustling leaves, distant owls, the soft scurrying of small creatures, were entirely absent, leaving a hollow stillness that pressed against her ears. Even the wind, which normally whispered through the ash trees like a passing spirit, seemed to avoid the area, bending around the clearing rather than through it. She noticed how no insects clung to the cabin walls and no birds perched on the surrounding branches, as if every living thing had learned long ago to keep its distance. The absence of life did not feel peaceful, it felt like a warning carved into the air itself. At night, the silence deepened into something suffocating. Lying on the narrow bed her father insisted she use, she found herself listening for familiar sounds simply to confirm she was not trapped in a dream. But each night offered only more quiet, thick and unnatural, as if the darkness swallowed every noise before it had a chance to be heard. She tried closing her eyes and pretending the woods beyond the window were the same woods she had known since childhood, but the cabin's presence made everything feel distorted. Shadows on the walls moved differently here, stretching too slowly or flickering as though someone unseen passed behind them. At times she thought she heard a faint tapping from within the walls, rhythmic and persistent, yet whenever she sat up to listen more closely the sound melted away, leaving her unsure if it had ever existed at all. One evening, as she stepped outside to gather her breath in the open air, she sensed something watching her from between the trees. She could feel the weight of an unseen gaze pressing against her skin, the way wild animals observe a threat from a hidden place. But unlike an animal's wary curiosity, this gaze felt deliberate, intelligent, and ancient. She turned quickly, expecting to see a figure or at least the glint of eyes catching the moonlight, but there was only the dark wall of trees standing silent and unbroken. Her father dismissed her fears when she told him, insisting she was merely overwhelmed by their new beginning, but the tremor in his voice betrayed that he knew more than he admitted. His refusal to acknowledge the strangeness only deepened her suspicion that whatever lurked beyond the cabin's threshold was not a creature but something tied to the rituals he revered. As days passed, the noises she couldn't understand grew more distinct. She began hearing distant murmurs at dusk, voices carried on air that didn't move. They were faint, like echoes of conversations spoken long before she arrived, rising and fading with a cadence that felt purposeful. The woods no longer felt like a place she could enter freely, they felt like they were waiting for her to take a step too far, to cross an unseen line her mother had once recognized and feared. Each sound, or lack of sound, wove itself into a tightening net of dread, making her realize the forest was not simply silent, it was watchful, aware of her presence, and listening for the moment she finally understood why it had fallen quiet the night her mother died. The mother's journal appeared one rainy afternoon, tucked behind a loose plank in the cabin's floorboards, its leather cover mottled with age and dampness as though it had been waiting for her to find it. She hesitated before opening it, feeling the weight of her mother's presence in every worn crease and the smell of ink that had long dried but still carried a metallic bite. The first pages were mundane at first, entries about chores, meals, and fleeting memories of lighter days, but as she flipped through, the tone shifted, growing darker, heavier, as if the journal itself were drawing her toward secrets her mother had desperately tried to shield her from. The writing became more frantic, a series of warnings embedded in careful loops of cursive, cautioning about things in the house, the woods, and above all, her father. Her mother had described him in a way that made her stomach twist, not the man she remembered from bedtime stories, but someone consumed by an obsession with lineage, bloodlines, and rituals meant to preserve a family legacy that demanded fear and silence. The entries recounted the mother's mounting unease, her growing dread of her husband's nightly excursions into the forest and his fixation on old symbols she didn't understand. She had written of strange carvings appearing in the walls of their home, patterns she swore she had never seen before, and of whispered words that seemed to echo from the trees themselves. There were passages in which she pleaded with herself to remain calm, to keep her daughter safe, though the words were tinged with despair, as if the act of writing them offered only a temporary reprieve from the terror pressing at her chest. The mother hinted at rituals, calling them traditions of the family, though she wrote with a fear so palpable it made the girl's fingers tremble as she traced the ink. Each entry seemed more desperate than the last, as though her mother had been counting down the days until some inevitable event she could not prevent. One of the last entries described a night much like the one that had brought her father to the cabin with her, though written years before her own memory began. Her mother spoke of being forced into the woods for ceremonies that had left her shaken, mentioning figures carved from wood, strange objects wrapped in cloth, and a circle cleared of life where nothing living dared to enter. She wrote cryptically, masking some of the horrors with allegory and metaphor, yet the girl understood the fear that had consumed her mother. There was a passage where her mother had questioned whether the bloodline itself carried a curse, whether it demanded sacrifices that would never be spoken aloud, and whether she could ever protect the daughter she loved from its weight. The journal made her see her father in a new light, one that matched the chill she had felt in the cabin's shadowed corners. His attentiveness, his insistence on isolation, the strange reverence he held for the forest and its rituals, all were pieces of a puzzle her mother had tried desperately to expose. Every word she read deepened her dread, revealing that the calm facade of family life had been a fragile veil, concealing patterns of obsession and tradition that had always lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when her mother could no longer intervene. The arrival of strangers in town was subtle at first, almost easy to overlook, but their presence carried a weight that unsettled everyone who noticed them. They appeared in the market, quietly observing the townsfolk, asking carefully framed questions about the Harrow family without revealing why they cared. The girl watched from a distance as her father's eyes narrowed the first time he saw them, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps fear, passing over his face before he masked it with his usual calm. The strangers were meticulous, almost unnerving in the way they gathered fragments of information: the mother's sudden death, the strange rituals rumored to take place in the woods, and the odd behaviors of the father, all whispered in casual conversations with merchants and neighbors. No one knew their true intentions, But the air in town grew taut with curiosity and unease, as if the shadows themselves were holding their breath. When the girl finally saw them more closely, she realized they were unlike anyone she had encountered before. Their eyes seemed to carry knowledge beyond what mere observation could grant, as if they had walked through places others feared to tread, spoken to people long forgotten, and carried secrets from histories the town had tried to bury. They wore plain clothing that blended with the locals, yet there was an air of purpose about them that made people step aside instinctively, even if they did not understand why. The strangers moved with careful deliberation, taking note of every detail, the pattern of the father's house, the path leading into the woods, and, most chillingly, the girl herself, who felt the weight of their attention like a hand pressing against her chest. One afternoon, the strangers approached her directly, speaking in low, measured tones. They asked questions about the forest, about her father's habits, and about the traditions that had long been whispered about in hushed conversations among the villagers. She hesitated, caught between instinctive fear and a strange compulsion to respond. They hinted that her family was entwined in something ancient, something that had endured beyond memory, and that the forest around the Harrow home was not merely wild but a witness to deeds and rituals that demanded understanding or intervention. Their words were cryptic, layered with warnings she barely understood, yet the urgency in their eyes left no doubt that they were speaking truths her father had spent a lifetime concealing. The girl left the encounter shaken, the stranger's presence lingering in her thoughts like a shadow that would not dissipate. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed of the cabin, she could still feel their gaze piercing the darkness, and she began to sense that whatever forces her father had summoned in the woods might now be in motion, noticed by eyes beyond the ordinary. The strangers had come not by accident, and their knowledge, though partial, suggested a reckoning was approaching, one that might finally expose the full reach of her father's obsession and the hidden horrors her mother had fought to keep secret. The visions began slowly, almost imperceptibly, first as fleeting glimpses in the corner of her eye, then as vivid apparitions that haunted her waking hours and invaded her sleep. At first, she thought she was imagining her mother's face, a trick of memory intensified by fear and grief, but the presence felt tangible, pressing against her chest with the urgency of a warning. In the dim light of the cabin, she would see her mother standing at the edge of the bed, pale and trembling, her lips moving as if speaking words that could not cross the threshold of sound. Sometimes the visions came in the reflection of a lantern flame, a shimmer in the windowpane, or in the rustle of the trees outside the cabin, as though her mother's spirit had found ways to manifest in every corner of the world that her father controlled. These nightly visitations carried messages she could barely comprehend. The mother's eyes, wide and fearful, seemed to insist that the daughter escape, that she understand the danger before it became too late. She would reach for her, but the hand dissolved into mist just as she tried to touch it, leaving a cold emptiness that spread from her fingers to her heart. The mother's warnings were never direct, they came as fragments, glimpses of shadows moving through the forest, glimpses of carvings she hadn't noticed before, hints of objects hidden within the cabin that held a significance she had yet to understand. Yet the urgency was unmistakable, a silent insistence that the girl grasp the truth before her father's plans reached their ultimate conclusion. During the day, the visions lingered in echoes, their impact growing stronger with each encounter. While tending to the cabin or walking the edges of the clearing, she would see fleeting images of her mother pointing, whispering, or fleeing from something invisible, leaving behind an impression of terror and insistence. Even the simplest movements, her reflection in a polished wooden table, the sway of a branch in the wind, could trigger the mother's presence, making her feel watched, guided, and simultaneously trapped. The veil between the living world and whatever lingered beyond it seemed thinner here, in the cabin her father had chosen, and she began to understand that the mother's warnings were not mere dreams or hallucinations, but fragments of reality woven into visions meant to protect her. As the nights wore on, the girl's fear became intertwined with determination. She realized that these visitations were not merely hauntings, but instructions encoded in fleeting images and whispered gestures, urging her to act before her father completed whatever ritual he had begun. Each vision strengthened her awareness that the woods themselves, the cabin, and the mysterious carvings were all part of a web she had to navigate carefully. She began to trace the symbols, follow the shadows, and listen to the whispers, learning to decipher her mother's presence even when it was only a flicker at the edge of sight, understanding that failure to heed them could mean more than fear, it could mean losing herself entirely to the darkness her father had summoned. The truth about her father revealed itself in pieces, each one more horrifying than the last, until the girl could no longer deny the darkness that had taken root in him long before her mother's death. It started with small discoveries: a drawer she had never opened, filled with weathered parchments inscribed with symbols she could not read, diagrams of human figures intertwined with tree roots, and notes in her father's meticulous hand describing a lineage that demanded more than loyalty, it demanded sacrifice. He spoke of it sometimes in low murmurs, words carried on the wind like half-formed prayers, his tone reverent and terrifying. The obsession was not simply for control or inheritance, it was for transformation, a belief that the marriage between them could unlock something ancestral, something that would elevate their bloodline beyond the limitations of mortal flesh. Each revelation pulled the girl deeper into a labyrinth of horror, leaving her unsure where fear ended and reality began. She discovered relics hidden around the cabin, objects her father had collected from the woods and beyond, some carved from bone, some from wood, each marked with cryptic runes that pulsed with a sense of purpose she could not name. He treated these objects with a devotion that bordered on worship, arranging them in careful patterns, circling them with candles, and whispering to them as though they were living participants in his design. When she questioned their meaning, he offered only cryptic explanations, speaking of continuity, destiny, and the promises of their forebears. His eyes, once merely watchful, now glimmered with a fanatical intensity, and she realized with growing terror that he believed their union would complete a cycle begun centuries ago, a cycle tied to rituals, blood, and the very soil beneath the cabin. The girl began to notice the small ways her father manipulated her understanding of the world, guiding her thoughts and actions toward the edges of obedience and fear. He spoke of loyalty as if it were a shield against forces beyond comprehension, and he emphasized secrecy with a quiet insistence that made her hesitate even to breathe in front of strangers. Every lesson, every admonition, every seemingly tender gesture was layered with intention, a subtle weaving of control and indoctrination. She started to understand that her father's affection was not affection at all but a method of shaping her into the instrument of his design. The most terrifying revelation came when she pieced together fragments from his journals, the mother's warnings, and her own observations of his behavior. He did not see her as a daughter, but as the final key to an ancient promise, one that demanded her compliance and her blood. He believed the marriage was not merely legal or symbolic, it was transformative, a literal unlocking of power that had been dormant in the family for generations. In that knowledge, the girl felt the forest's silence press in on her, a reminder that the world outside the cabin might never intervene. Her father's obsession had been centuries in the making, and now, whether she wanted it or not, she was the next chapter in its horrifying continuation. The night of the final confrontation arrived with a heaviness that seemed to press down on the entire forest, turning every tree into a silent sentinel and every shadow into a potential witness. The wind had died, leaving an eerie stillness, and the moon hung pale and low, casting long, angular shapes across the clearing where the cabin and the stone circle met. The girl moved carefully, each step crunching softly against the damp earth, feeling the weight of anticipation coil in her chest like a living thing. Her father had prepared the space meticulously, arranging the carved figurines, the bundles of ritual objects, and the candles in a precise pattern that seemed to pulse with a sinister life of its own. He waited for her at the center, his expression a mixture of calm reverence and the fanaticism she had come to fear, and in that moment she understood fully that he expected her to comply, to become the instrument through which the ritual would reach its horrifying conclusion. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet the forest itself seemed to resist her movement, as though the trees and shadows conspired to keep her inside the circle. She remembered the mother's journal, the whispered warnings in her visions, and the cryptic instructions left by the strangers who had come to town. They all pointed toward a singular truth: she could not allow the ritual to reach its end, not without confronting her father and the darkness he had devoted himself to for decades. The carvings on the cabin walls, the symbols etched in the ground, the objects he had prepared, all of it was part of a machinery she had to understand in order to dismantle. The candlelight flickered, and with each movement, the air grew thicker, almost tangible, as if the past, present, and some unseen future were converging upon the clearing simultaneously. Her father began the incantation, low and measured, his voice weaving a cadence that felt older than the forest itself. The figurines seemed to tremble under the weight of his words, shadows twisting unnaturally across the ground. She realized that stopping him would require more than physical resistance. It demanded knowledge, courage, and a willingness to confront the ancestral obsession that had consumed him. As he gestured toward her, eyes gleaming with fanatic devotion, the girl felt the pull of the lineage, a magnetic force urging her into compliance, but she pushed back, drawing on every lesson her mother had hidden in the journal, every warning embedded in the visions that had haunted her nights. The air vibrated with tension, the forest silent and expectant, the shadows stretching and coiling as if alive. She had reached the moment where the full truth about her father, the bloodline, and the dark heritage he worshipped would no longer remain hidden. The clearing itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the ritual would complete, binding her to a fate she had never chosen, or whether she would rise against it, confronting the terror that had been cultivated in the woods for generations and challenging the force that had claimed her mother's life and sought to claim hers.